Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome. I want to welcome you also specifically on behalf of the Vikram Sarabhai Library Extension, which is housed here within the JSW School of Public Policy. And I think it's a great occasion for the library extension as well as the school to host its first book talk by Professor Pranab Bardhan here. It's a very long introduction, but I will still take my time so that all of us here can appreciate his contribution to the field. Professor Pranab Bardhan is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Economics at the Department of Economics at University of California, Berkeley. He received his PhD from Cambridge University. He has been at UC Berkeley since 1977, prior to which he spent time teaching at MIT and the Delhi School of Economics. He was the chief editor of the Journal of Development Economics from 1985 to 2003. He was co-chair of the MacArthur Foundation-funded Network on the Effects of Inequality on Economic Performance from 1996 to 2007. He also held the Distinguished Fulbright Siena Chair at the University of Siena in Italy for the years 2008-2009. He was the BP Centennial Professor at London School of Economics in 2010 and 2011. He has authored 17 books and edited 14 other books, and is an author of more than 150 journal articles, many of which are published in leading economics journals. His latest book, which we are here to talk about today, A World of Insecurity, Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries, is published by Harvard University Press in 2022. His current research involves theoretical and empirical work on decentralized governance and the political economy of development in China and India. So, yeah, as I said, it is a long, extremely illustrious academic career that Professor Bardhan has had, and he's going to share a lot from his recent work with us. I will also briefly just open up by saying a little bit about the book, World of Insecurity, Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries, which is an ambitious account of the corrosion of liberal democracy in rich and poor countries alike, arguing that anti-democratic sentiment reflects fear of material and cultural loss, not a critique of liberalism's failure to deliver equality, and he suggests possible ways out of it. It argues for context-sensitive responses, and I think I will leave Professor Bardhan to say more about it. The format of the talk is very much a Q&A. Professor Bardhan will start by saying more about his work and the book, of course, in particular, and then it will be an open floor for all of you to interact with him. So looking forward very much to your questions. Over to you, Professor Bardhan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Namrata, for those generous remarks. Thanks to the organizers of this event, including the Sarabhai Library, and thanks to all of you for coming to listen to me and then to have this discussion afterward. So, two microphones, so you don't need that. So what I'm going to do is very briefly tell you about the contents of the book, and then I'd be happy to answer your questions. The book came out in late 2022, and it's somewhat unusual for my other books, these 17 books that Namrata mentioned. Except for one or two other books, most of my other books are technical books. But this book is deliberately different. It's actually meant for a general readership. This book does not have any equations, no charts, not even any footnote. So it's like more a very general, aimed at a very general readership. And also, even though I'm an economist, this book has some economics, but much of it is on politics and culture. So you might regard it as more an exercise in political economy and political culture. And of course, as she said, it's about the erosion of democracy all over the world, including, of course, India, but all over the world. And that's why the subtitle is Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries. The distinction is important because there's now a lot of books in the literature about erosion of democracy in rich countries, particularly United States and Europe. There are not that many books about developing countries. In my book, I talk quite a bit about developing countries. Among developing countries, I emphasize 3 countries. One is, of course, India. The second is Turkey. And the third is Brazil. Brazil under Bolsonaro, who got defeated recently in the Brazilian presidential election. So in fact, the erosion of democracy, in fact, political scientists are saying that democracy used to collapse with military coups, etc., but no longer. There are coups. I mean, for example, in Myanmar, Sudan, there have been coups, but that's not the general pattern. Democracy dies. In fact, there is a book called by 2 famous Harvard professors, How Democracies Die. And it says democracies die while at any given moment, you are not sure, are we a democracy? Are we not? And so on. You slowly, it's like in fact, in my book, I say, you all know the story about the proverbial frog in the pan. It slowly gets boiled to death. It doesn't jump suddenly or another metaphor would be, it doesn't end with a bang, but with a whimper. Now, question to me, people usually talk about in terms of leaders, whether it's Bolsonaro, Trump, in our country, Modi, Erdogan in Turkey. I personally think it's not the person. What are the systemic issues that is behind this almost worldwide phenomenon? So most of the book is on those systemic issues behind this phenomenon. And so in the first part of the book, I will, for example, devote myself to the following question. A lot of people, particularly on the left, say that this has something to do with something else that's happening in the world, in the economic world, of rising inequality. So workers, disgusted by the rising inequality, are turning to these leaders. I personally don't think, and that is a very popular explanation, I don't subscribe to that explanation. For various reasons, let me mention, in fact, in my one chapter, largely it's about this, but let me tell you just 1 or 2 things why I don't believe in it, in this particular hypothesis, is if the workers are really that much disgusted by inequality, why are they rallying under the banner of billionaires? Trump is a billionaire. Erdogan in Turkey is a billionaire. Orban in Hungary is a billionaire. Putin, of course, is no longer, people don't regard him as a Democrat anymore. Putin is a billionaire. Brexit in England was under the leadership originally by Nigel Farage, who's a plutocrat. In India, Modi, of course, is not a billionaire, but he's cozy with billionaires. So it's not the attitude to inequality that workers' mind is what is. I say that it has more to do with the insecurity. And that's why the title is The World of Insecurity. Workers, what I'm saying, workers are worried about the insecurity in their own lives. They don't really care, the top 1%, how much extra wealth they're accumulating. So it's not the inequality, the relative inequality as such, but the increase in insecurity in their own lives. And when I say insecurity, the book is really on two kinds of insecurity. One is economic insecurity, insecurity of jobs, insecurity of incomes, things like that. But a large part of the book, and that's where the cultural part comes in, I call it cultural insecurity. But here, culture defined in a very broad sense, namely all kinds of non-economic insecurity in our lives all over the world that has increased over time. So in the next few minutes, I'll come to cultural insecurity, but let me go to economic security. One might say that issues like inequality, economic insecurity, these are quite often regarded as left-wing issues. Why are the workers then turning to right-wing leaders? That's a puzzle, that's a paradox. So the first part of my book is trying to understand that. Why work issues, if the issues are really inequality, economic insecurity, those are usually what left-wing people will tell you. But why are the workers turning right? So I give several reasons. In the short time, I will just mention 2 or 3. One is, that's not the major reason, but I think it's an important reason. These so-called right-wing leaders are in a sense co-opting some of these left-wing issues. And let me explain what I mean by it. With the possible exception of the United States. In the other cases in Europe, all these right-wing, sometimes extreme right-wing parties, they want the welfare state. This is not the old type of right-wing who do not want the state. Most of these right-wing parties want a strong state and want a welfare state. So let me give the example why the United States is an exception. So Poland has now an extreme right-wing government. They're just as we have Hindu nationalists, they have Catholic nationalists. Catholic nationalists, but they want a very strong welfare state for the workers, including in a big way, child assistance programs. The same child assistance programs which are rejected by the right-wing Republican Party in the United States. So United States is an exception. In India, if you know, all of you must be knowing about the welfare program of Mr. Modi. Not merely the earlier welfare program he has maintained, namely the Employment Guarantee Scheme, Food Security Act, Awas Yojana, the housing scheme. Those were the earlier government, but he has continued with them, and which sometimes with more vigor. And then Modi has introduced new welfare programs like the Ujala, which is the subsidized cooking gas program, Swachh Bharat, and then Awas Yojana is even more vigorous. Same in Turkey. Erdogan has done a lot about housing and done a lot about health policy. So these are right-wing in some sense, but they are not continuing the welfare state. So in a sense, they have co-opted some what used to be called left-wing issues. So that way, they have neutralized part of the appeal of the left. Secondly, traditionally, the major resistance to right-wing governments all over the world used to be trade unions. And trade unions over time have declined all over the world, certainly in India, but much more in rich countries. Just to give you one piece of statistics, if you compare 1985 with today, for OECD countries, the rich countries, the membership in trade unions have become half. Between 1985 and 2020, the membership has declined. As a result, the former resistance to right-wing governments used to come from trade unions. That's no longer there, or it's much weaker. And there's a very important economic reason for it, why trade unions are weaker. One reason is that, formerly, multinational companies who had enormous profits, they used to do what I call rent sharing. The profits, this extra rent, extra profits that they used to get, they were sharing with trade unions. So in the bargaining process, trade unions used to get some share. But over time, the share of workers declined. Why? Because with globalization, international competition increased. So when competition increased, labor lost asymmetrically. Why? Because capital could always say, if you don't give my deal, if you don't stick to the deal that I'm giving you, I'm going to go elsewhere. So the threat, capital had the threat of going elsewhere in the globalized world. Whereas labor could not give an equal amount of threat. That, look, if you don't increase my wages, I'm going to go elsewhere. That threat is not credible. So in this asymmetric deal under globalization, labor lost out. So that's a major reason why trade unions. So, and labor found that trade unions are not useless. They're not helping in getting that rent share. So that's why trade union declined. There are other structural reasons. Let me mention one or two. Over time, as the knowledge economy becomes wider, there's a gulf among workers between knowledge workers, professional workers, in general, white-collar workers, and blue-collar workers, the manual workers. This division was always there, but now with computers and everything, that division, that gulf has widened. So there's a division within labor. So labor is not as united as before. Second is that all countries, including India, the service sector is more important now compared to manufacturing and transportation. Manufacturing, transportation used to be the sector where trade unions used to be strong all over the world. But that sector is declining in relative importance. The service sector is more difficult to organize because service is more dispersed. Although United States and Canada and Europe have some service sector unions, but service sector unions are not as strong as the earlier labor unions. And in the pandemic, this was obvious. One of the major service sector that became prominent in the pandemic was caregiving workers. Okay, but caregiving workers all over the world are unorganized, unprotected, and quite often underpaid. So because of the division between manufacturing and transportation and service sector and increasing important service sector, there's another division of workers which weakened the labor movement. And the third, which is very much in India, but also now increasingly coming in rich countries, is the formal-informal division. As you know, in India, the overwhelming majority of workers are informal workers. Even in the non-agricultural sector is all informal workers, almost all. But even in non-agricultural sector, nearly 3/4 of workers in India are informal workers without benefits, without pensions, things like that. This informal division is a major reason why the labor movement in India is very weak. Because those who organize labor, trade union labor, is only a small part of the total labor force, whereas the others are left outside. Now, interestingly, this informal labor is increasing in rich countries. Why? The gig economy workers, the people who are delivering, or Uber drivers. So this informal gig economy is increasing in importance in rich countries. So the informal sector is increasing there as well. And so the division, this third division between informal and informal, which was always important in poor countries, is now becoming important in rich countries. So I've given you some reasons why the trade union movement is declining. And trade unions used to play a very important role, as I already said, in resisting right-wing extremism. Another reason that has come up, let me, you should stop me because professors have a tendency to go on talking. Let me now go on to the cultural issue. This is all kind of economic issue. The cultural issue is that particularly it takes, culture is of course different in different countries, but cultural issue takes different form therefore in different countries. But the cultural insecurity, I'll give you examples, which right-wing extremists have used a lot. In Europe, in the United States, the cultural issue that has been used a lot is that of immigration. Immigration brings culturally alien people, and a lot of workers are rejecting. So immigration is a hot issue. Okay, so even the immigration can be an economic issue as well, but it's not just, it's a major cultural issue. Even in countries, say Sweden, which is very interesting, after my book came out, the Swedish government is now run by, is run by a right-wing party backed by an extreme right-wing party. In Sweden, which is a mecca of social democracy. And there the issue is immigration. Economic security is not a major problem because welfare state is very strong. So workers' economic security is looked after in Sweden, but they're worried about immigration. In other countries, India, Turkey, Indonesia, cultural insecurity takes a form in terms of religion-based tensions. Islamic nationalism in Turkey and Indonesia, Hindu nationalism in India, Catholic nationalism, I already told you, in Poland. In fact, in Bolsonaro's Brazil, his major vote came from Christian evangelicals. Trump also mobilized large numbers of Christian evangelicals. So religious issues, religious tensions is a major part of cultural insecurity. This insecurity, by the way, may be manufactured because the insecurity may not be really there. Let me give you an example. When immigration is the cultural issue, you ask, surveyors have asked people in Europe, what do you think is the proportion of immigrants in the population? They will say 30%. Actual number is probably 5%, 7%. So there's an inflated idea of that cultural danger, alien culture invading us. In fact, in France, right-wing intellectuals have now a theory called the Great Replacement Theory. These Muslim immigrants are going to replace the original, the French population. So this manufactured, I call it manufactured victimhood, which is, you see that in India as well. In India, I'm surprised sometimes, even in high upper class households, I have been present when people have discussed this. Look, yes, Muslims are only about 14–15% of the population, but they're going to outnumber us because look at their fertility rate. Okay, so I tell them, look, compare the fertility rate of a Muslim woman in Kerala with the fertility rate of a Hindu woman in Uttar Pradesh. The Muslim woman's fertility rate in Kerala is much lower than the Hindu woman's fertility in Uttar Pradesh. Why? because the Muslim woman happens to be more educated in Kerala. So mother's education is a primary determinant of fertility rate, not religion. Look at Bangladesh, a poorer Muslim country. The rate of fertility decline in Bangladesh is much faster than in India. So this manufactured victimhood that they're going to outnumber us. Same in Europe, as I said. We see this all the time. So this insecurity need not be real insecurity. It would be stoked, manufactured sometimes. These kind of things, trade unions used to play an important role in taming. In my book, I said, taming and transcending nativist passions, which trade unions used to play a role. So trade unions are not just wage bargaining institutions. Trade union played a cultural role. With the decline of trade unions, this has become more and more important in countries. Last point is the toxic role of social media. I think in the right-wing extremist rise, social media has played a very important role. I have a whole section on that. Let me give you just one piece of data. You might say, well, left-wing also use social media, but there's a difference. So I'll give you the example. 3 months before Trump's presidential election in 2016, they did a survey. In the 3 months up to the election in November 2016, false stories spread in social media were then retweeted, etc., to estimated 30 million people. False stories about Trump. False stories not about Trump, false stories favoring Trump spread to 30 million. So that's what, whereas false stories favoring Hillary Clinton, his rival at that time, there's also false stories favoring Hillary Clinton, was only about 7 or 8 million. So it's a big difference. And social media, what I call it an it's a self-reinforcing echo chamber of extremism. And the more outrageous the story you spread, it becomes viral. And as it becomes viral, social media companies also make money. So there is a vicious cycle there. And that has also been a major. So I have a whole section on social media. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Bardhan. A lot of thoughts have been put out there. So the floor is now open. As I said, it's a Q&A format. So any questions that you have for Professor Bardhan, please. So we already have a couple here. Is there a microphone? Yeah, there and then.
Ajit Mathur here. And
he's already standing.
Sorry about that. Good evening, Professor Bardhan. Like amongst the economic reason that you have mentioned, do you also think that the falling rate of profit is also one of the reason that one can attribute?
I didn't catch your word.
The falling rate of profit.
The falling rate of profit
is an important determinant for, let's say, the weakening of, because of the fact that led to the spread of globalization, and that could have also, led to weakening of the power of labor.
Can you also briefly just introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Anand. I'm an RA here.
Falling rate of profit used to be a part of Marxist theory. I don't think in the era of globalization, the globalization actually increased the rate of corporate profits. If you ask me, one reason the rate of profit has remained quite high in many countries is because, and in fact, I could speak only about the first half of my book. The second half of the book is on some of these issues. So one of the issues that I did not discuss in my initial presentation is, in this period, corporate concentration has gone up quite a bit. a conglomerate capitalism of various kinds, including in India. India today is essentially big corporates, conglomerates who are in various kinds of business has increased. And as a result, profits have gone up, productivity has not. So much of the profit is because of exertion of monopoly power, monopoly capital. And that, I don't think workers' disenchantment about democracy has to do with that, because that's a left-wing issue. Going back to what I said, why issues are left-wing quite often, inequality, corporate concentration, etc. Why are workers turning right? That to me is the paradox that we have to explain, and I've indicated some explanation. Maybe I should go now.
I think I agree with almost everything that you have said, since I have myself researched the decline of trade unions and the interactivity between product markets and labor markets. But there are two questions I'm still wondering about. One is that labor was always immobile, because capital could always move across borders, labor could not move that freely. So that was always there before. So labor was not exercising any power by exit. It was exercising power through countervailing power in the form of strikes, struggles, lockouts, and that kind of. Second is that service sector unions always being weak is not true. There have been very strong banking unions. There have been very strong railway unions, transport workers unions. Even today, some of the strikes happening in the UK as we speak are transport sector strikes. So I was wondering whether you could give us some explanation about why the trade union movement lost its capacity to exercise countervailing power, rather not exit, but countervailing power,
right,
in the form of strikes.
Right. In response to your first question, yes, that threat, capital's threat, was always there. But I think something happened, as I mentioned. What has been going on was some kind of rent sharing. The monopoly, the multinational companies were earning a rent of kind, and unions shared in that rent. There was a rent sharing between the monopoly, the multinational companies, and the trade unions. As I didn't mention the word, but I do mention the word in my book. With globalization, particularly with what is called the China shock, the Chinese really is just wiped out many of the jobs in United States, particularly, but also in Europe. So with that China shock, labor became particularly asymmetric in terms of, because there the capital could say that we could go somewhere else, which is always true, but now that became heightened because of the labor completely losing all jobs. And also, as I mentioned, also part of the labor, the divisions in the labor force are much stronger now. Now, I talked about the knowledge workers versus other manual workers, that division as well. Going to the service sector, yes, service sector, by the way, that's why I'm distinguishing between manufacturing and transport workers, which were the major trade union based, like the Teamsters Union in the United States, etc., in Britain. So I was not counting them among the service workers. I'm also not counting the bank workers, because bank workers are the more, it's like what used to be called labor aristocracy, because they are much better paid and so on. And in general, in India, for example, bank workers are mainly public sector employees. I'm thinking more of the private sector trade unions. So the division was always there, but it's sharpened now between manufacturing, transport workers on the one hand, and though that sector is in relative decline, whereas the other service sectors, particularly in rich countries, the caregiving workers, that has become much more important, and the gig economy workers have become much more important. And that sector is weaker. Even though there are service sector unions which are trying to organize them. And in fact, I mentioned, there's a whole chapter where I discuss this. The European unions are now trying to adjust. For example, the largest industrial union in Germany, IG Metall, now, after all these years, are now becoming much more open to informal workers. So gradually things are changing in Britain. So many of the informal workers are self-employed. They're not like wage workers. So the standard methods of wage bargaining don't apply there. So now I forget the name of the UK union, what they're doing is, so for example, if you're a self-employed vendor selling something, you need online good reviews, customer reviews. So some of these unions are now trying to get good customer reviews for self-employed workers. So these are new methods that are coming up. And one way social media helped, I told you about the bad effects of social media. Social media helps in organizing scattered workers. See, scattered workers, I already said, are difficult to unionize. But now, with social media, gives you a technique of organizer workers. As I read somewhere, now they say it never rains on a Twitter strike. Because on Twitter, you are organizing people together. But of course, getting people physically together has a different effect.
Good evening, Professor Bardhan, and thanks for sharing your talks. I'm Piyush. I'm a PhD student here at IIMA. So I had a question regarding, so you have talked basically about the extent across countries, both in rich and poor countries. So I had a specific question regarding other than the national levels that you have talked about already, at the subnational levels or even at the local levels, do you see that this kind of the decline of democracy is happening even at the lower levels of governance, given that they also have either institutions or platforms for most democratic processes such as assemblies or various platforms. Media is also there at the local level. So do you also see that at the subnational levels, especially in large countries like India, do they have a role to play?
Right. In all this across countries, there is a systematic attempt to centralize, including in India. I think since 2014, forces of centralization have become much more important. I used to, I think she mentioned in my research, I've been working on decentralization for the last 2 decades. Most of the data that I collected were from villages in West Bengal, Panchayat. By the way, if you are interested in, I don't go into this in detail. If you're interested in this response to your question, in my book, there's a whole section on decentralization. But very casually, let me say that I think in India, decentralization, except for one state, doesn't work. And it is Kerala. In all other states, decentralization is declining. So let me give you, I already said that I collected data on West Bengal. This was in the CPM period. But now, for example, even in the last days of CPM, it was changing. But now, since 2011, in West Bengal, the chief minister does everything through the administrators. Not the Panchayat election is there, but everything is done by the block development officer. Okay. So, and of course, I would say from Delhi now, quite often, directly, in fact, since Delhi government is not friendly terms with the West Bengal government, so they go over the West Bengal government and go directly to the district level collectors. Again, administrators, not the panchayats. So elected local officers are much less important today compared to even say 20 years back. So in India, I would say decentralization, except for Kerala, is in decline. And this, by the way, is not just here. This is very strange. In fact, I have a whole chapter in my book, the second chapter, in the Brexit UK movement. There was a slogan, "Back to the community." That was Brexit slogan, right-wing slogan. And I say, but actually, quite often, in the name of the slogan of the "back to the community," they strengthen a strong leader who centralizes. And the forces of centralization in India are very strong now, because everything, quite often, earlier, for example, if you think of the period in India between 1990 and 2010, this is the period when the regional parties were strong. So at least at the state level, not at the sub-state level, not the district or municipal or village panchayat level, state level leaders had some power because they were part of the coalition governments in Delhi, so they exerted themselves. But now there's one strong national party. So that is also another reason why the forces of decentralization today much weaker.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Navnath. I'm assistant librarian here. So my question is related to public institutions. What is their role in declining this democracy? In US, we see the institute like Cato Institute is there who help right-wing organizations to have their policy formulation and creating a public opinion. So how do you see in other countries, public institutions are playing this role, and how do you see them doing this in this process?
This has been going on for quite some time in US, because the private sector, quite often billionaires, donate to this, what they call the think tanks. And the think tanks, Cato Institute that you mentioned is one of them. Think tanks, what they do, they influence the opinion-making process. So for example, Cato Institute will often write opinion pieces, op-ed pieces in the newspapers. So through media, they have been influencing opinion, etc. Unfortunately, in India, the media is now almost gone. The latest hostile takeover of NDTV is only the latest step of a gradual, the media, in fact, I cannot even watch Indian TV anymore because there's shouting matches going on, and essentially most of the time they are either cheerleaders or lapdogs of the government. So, and this, by the way, is not just India. The reason I'm saying this is a worldwide process. Erdogan is just completely destroyed the Turkish media. In fact, Bolsonaro's Brazil is somewhat of an exception. Brazil, even today, is media and judiciary. These two institutions in Brazil, they're still holding, which unfortunately is not true in either Turkey or India. In Turkey and India, the media is almost finished. Of course, there's always small media. I'm talking about the large influential media. And the judiciary is, in India, I'd say, is timid and erratic. Sometimes it gives you brave opinions, but most of the time not. Same in Turkey. And of course, in the United States, Supreme Court has been taken over by the right wing. So these countervailing institutions, unfortunately, are declining. And that's where I think is the major danger. It is not enough to blame individual leaders. There's a whole process that is going on all over the world.
Thank you, Professor Bardhan. My name is Abhishek. I am working as an academic associate. So you urged that you talked about in the book that the liberals to adopt at least a grudging respect for the local attachments. So can you please elaborate on the local attachment?
Okay.
Because in India, the local attachment may be different from what local attachment in other countries. Thank you.
That's part of the cultural issues that I discuss in the book. So for example, in the latter part of the book, which I did not have time to go into, I just mentioned that trade unions do not have just a wage bargaining institution. To me, they have a major cultural role, which with the decline of trade unions, cultural role is gone. And that's what I mean, that we have to revive, and here trade unions have to work with community level organizers. And this is also should be part of the environmental movement, where local community workers, because usually these days, whenever people say environment, they think of climate change, which of course is a major issue. But there's a lot of local environmental issues. So for example, our rivers are poisoned. That is not due to global developed countries' climate change effects. Our air is polluted. That is not due to the rich countries' actions. It is our own actions. Our forests are deforestation, is our own action. So those are local issues on which labor organizations, sometimes even local community organizations can get together. And in fact, I was going to say even religious organizations can get together. In the United States, I've seen not all, many churches are reactionary, but some churches play a very important role in the local environmental movement. They say we have to protect God's earth, and that's a very, worth following movement. So yes, I actually have a whole section on labor's non-wage bargaining cultural role. And that's what I mean when you say about the local issue. Unfortunately, many of these right-wing leaders are trying to not merely weaken media and judiciary that I mentioned, and election commission, but they're also trying to weaken local community organizations. NGOs, for example, today are much weaker. In fact, in India, NGOs have been really hit hard. If you talk to NGOs, you will find out they are hit hard by, say, the FCRA, which is the Foreign Contribution Regulatory Act, which to me is very ironical. FCRA is the major weapon being used against NGOs. So I say, let me give you an example. Political party in India, is it an NGO or is it a public entity? It's important. Why? If political party is an NGO, then the FCRA should apply to the political party? No. There is a law now. Our current government has introduced that law. There is a law by which FCRA cannot apply to the political party. Not merely so, the law that was done, I forget which year, 2018 or something, FCRA cannot be applied to them retroactive to 1975. So some political party took money in 1980 that you cannot raise it today. And of course, now they can get. So political party is not an NGO, okay, by this criteria. If political party is a public entity, another law should apply, RTI, Right to Information Act. No, political party is not subject to RTI. There they say we are not public, we are not a public organization. So you are not a public organization, therefore RTI doesn't happen. We are not an NGO. So what are you? Either NGO or GO. You have to be one of them. You cannot be both. So that is what's going on. And I don't see in the media any write-up about this. What is a political, is it an NGO or a GO? If NGO, FCA should apply to that. If GO, then RTI should apply to that. Political party is exempt from it. So nobody can question the money that is coming to the of course now electoral bond has made it much worse because there is no limit or no disclosure law. So these laws, there should be much more, at least discussion about this. I don't see much. I read 6 or 7 Indian newspapers every day. I don't see much discussion.
Yeah, geo here has another connotation that all of us know. So maybe
What is that connotation?
let's not get into that for later. But I think that was one of my questions. And you said you couldn't cover all the points in your book. A lot of what we are seeing, which you call democratic disenchantment, is also these processes which are changing in the background. And very few of us are aware of how these laws are being introduced, what is creeping into our constitution. Maybe you can throw a little bit of light on the legal aspects and how things are changing there.
Actually, I'd say even something behind legal, something before it becomes a law, it should be a deliberative process. The deliberative process is gone. You decide something without consulting with others. That's why then we have to withdraw. Farm laws. Farm laws, I have some problems with the farm laws myself, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the process. Farm laws, you do the farm laws without consulting farmers, without consulting state governments. Agriculture belongs to the state governments. You don't consult the state governments. You do this, ram it through the parliament, and then you have this huge movement, and then you withdraw. This is a tremendous wastage of time, energy, resources, and lives. 700 people died in the farmers' movement. So it's a tremendous wastage because there's no deliberation, there's no discussion.
Good evening, Professor Bardhan. I'm Shaunak. I'm an research associate here. Can you throw some light on the role of corruption by center-left parties, like especially in India and Brazil? Which
Are you talking about corruption in general or the political parties' corruption?
the corruption by political parties?
Okay, and that's related to something that I just mentioned. In fact, there's a whole, if you read my book, there's a whole section on funding of elections, whole section. And again, this is a discussion missing in India. There's a lot of discussion in Europe. If you're interested, I refer to this book. There is a woman who happens to be the wife of Thomas Piketty, which some of you may have heard about. Thomas Piketty is a good friend of mine. He and his wife, what's her name? Julia Cage. Julia Cage wrote a book called The Price of Democracy. So she has discussed the public, the funding of elections in different countries. She doesn't know about India. It's mostly about Europe and some Latin American countries. And I discuss her book in that section that I have on. I think it's very important to understand. And of course, India is one of the worst in this respect, this electoral bond scheme. Electoral bond scheme is really horrific in many senses. Not merely there is no limit, not merely no disclosure, much more than that. It's not that it's completely secret. Who knows who's donating? State Bank of India, because the bond is State Bank of India. There you have to disclose that you are putting in the money. And if the State Bank of India knows, the government knows. And so suppose I'm a big corporate tycoon, but I don't like the current government. I want to donate to UP or the Congress Party. I'll be afraid. Why? Because yes, the electoral bond is known. Nobody's supposed to know that I'm donating. But State Bank of India knows, therefore the government knows. So in a climate of intimidation and fear, I would not donate. So in this sense, I would say India today has one of the worst election funding situation all over the world. I've looked into, in that section, you will see. But in that section, by the way, I probably should have said this in the beginning. The first part of the book is about trying to understand what's going on. The second part of the book is what to do. There's not that much you can do, but at least try to do. And then in this context, the context of the question that you raised, I discussed a lot of proposals about public funding of elections. How is it different countries? We know very little, and I read about the public funding of elections in different countries, and also this Julia Kaje's book helped me. So, for example, Canada has a very interesting system of public funding of elections. So does France and and Sweden. So it's not that everything is we can do here, because as I said, we are in the opposite extreme. But one can learn about it is possible to do public funding of elections. Now, in the United States, there's a little bit of public funding, but of course, most of it is corporate donations. In Sweden, most of it used to be corporate donations, but now no longer, because the government is a generous funder of elections. So people don't take corporate donations, very little of it. They go for public funding. In the United States, is the opposite. If you read about elections of Obama, so in the United States, when I pay my taxes, there's a little box. Do you want to donate part of your taxes to a fund for elections? They don't any candidates. Whoever you want, it will go. And I usually tick that because I want public funding of elections. But there are some, if you take public money in the United States, there are restrictions on how much private money you can take. So Obama announced he's not going to take public money. Why? Because he was getting too much private money. So that will put restrictions on how much money. So I think it is important to study. It's very difficult to do in India now. But today, again, internet has made something. Internet has made it what is called crowdfunding easier. So, for example, this leftist leader in the United States, Bernie Sanders, corporate donation did not, no corporates would donate to him, but a lot of crowdfunding. And that is possible because of, again, I would say good things about social media, that he could raise quite a bit of money through small bits of money, but from large number of people. So those kind of issues that one should discuss.
So we have time maybe for one last questions, and then again, I'll pass it on to Professor Bardhan to give some closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bardhan. I'm Dr. Smita Premchandar. I teach a course on gender and development policies here in the Institute, and also one on microfinance. I'm sorry, I haven't yet read your book, but since you mentioned solutions, I really want to ask you, what do you think of how can we solve issues like cultural, especially the religion one, because it's the one that's ruining the country right now. And so if you have some thoughts, then it would be lovely to hear.
Okay.
Thank you.
I will mention about religion, but since you are interested in gender, I should also mention one part of my book, which goes into an economic issue relating to gender. But religion is a very difficult issue to solve, but I have a whole chapter on nationalism. It's called, the chapter heading is the fire of resurgent nationalism. I think it's very important to understand. So think of Pakistan. Pakistan is a state in our neighborhood formed on the basis of religious nationalism. Unfortunately, today, we are imitating Pakistan. We want our nationalism to be based on religion. So in a sense, after 70 years, we are imitating Pakistan. And many, as I said, many other countries are doing that, religion as a basis of nationalism. If you go back to the thinking of our leaders, I read up in this context writings of two important thinkers who thought about, they were nationalists, they are patriots, but they did not like religious nationalism. They even did not like, I'll mention the names, 2 names. They even did not like what they called the Western form of nationalism. Western form of nationalism, particularly German, was based on ethnicity. Not quite religion, of course, although the Nazis hated the Jews, so it became religious. But it's based in German nationalism is based on blood and soil. So these 2 names I'm thinking of, and I read up a lot of their writings on nationalism, and I quote them in my whole chapter on nationalism. One is Gandhi, and the other is Tagore. I should tell you my personal story. I come from a family where my uncle, who tried to assassinate a British governor, failed. Of course, most of these cases they failed, and he was life imprisonment, and then got, after 14 years of jail, he got released in 1947 with our independence. So I grew up in a family with a lot of nationalist zeal, patriotism and all that. Then when I went to college, I remember the first year in college, I used to know about Tagore a lot, but his poetry, his novels, his particularly his short stories, which are wonderful short stories. But I did not read at that time, first year in college, any of his essays. So I remember one day in the library, and this library plays a very important role, by the way, since this event is by library. Library plays a very important role. I would often go and browse in the library. Browsing, I found a big book of essay by Tagore in English on nationalism. These are his 1916 lectures on nationalism. He was invited by Japan to give a lecture on nationalism. As the first Asian Nobel laureate, Japan invited him. And he did something which Japanese did not like, because Japanese were very nationalist at the time. Tagore attacked. He said, you are taking the Western idea of nationalism. Nationalism based on ethnicity or religion. That's the wrong one. And the same, Gandhi and Tagore were disagreed on a lot of things. This is something on what should be the basis of our nationalism. So they formulated a different idea of nationalism. They are both, remember, they're both religious people. Both Gandhi and Tagore were highly religious people. And yet they didn't want Hindu nationalism. They wanted a syncretic kind of form, which then, by the time India became independent, both were, shortly after independence, Gandhi died. So in a sense, our initial nationalism is called, could be described as civic nationalism. Nationalism not on the basis of ethnicity, nationalism based not on the basis of religion, nationalism based on some constitutional values. Now, I discuss in my book the country which adopted constitutional nationalism or civic nationalism is the United States. If you think about the United States, in fact, I quote from a speech by Barack Obama, 2009, he said, it's a great strength of the United States is that we are not a Christian nation. We are a nation based on a constitution. The great German philosopher, Habermas, I quote from Habermas in my book, Habermas has a concept of what he called constitutional, that's his term, constitutional patriots. He says that, and because it's Germany, he says German nationalism is based on blood and soil and things like that. A whole Nazi movement came up that. By the way, if you read RSS leaders, not just Golwalkar, Savarkar, they admired the Nazi system, openly said that, because their nationalism is based on ethnicity, like the German nationalism. So Habermas is trying to deflect from there to what he call constitutional patriotism, what in my chapter I call civic nationalism. So it is possible, what I'm talking about, let me end that, I'm sure I'm talking too much, that Hindu nationalists in India will give you the impression this is the only form of nationalism. I think it is important to know there are other forms of nationalism, just as Hindu nationalists will tell you as if Hindutva is the only form of Hinduism. I can be a good Hindu, but not follow Savarkar's Hindutva. So you appropriate the whole Hindu religion to yourself. You appropriate the whole nationalism to religious nationalism. So I think it's important to point that out. That's not the only kind. There are other kinds that exist.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I guess we will now have to conclude the book talk. So please join me in thanking Professor Bardhan for his thoughts. There is something that the library would like to offer you. And I also want to mention, as Professor kept saying, there is a second part to his book. So his book is available right outside, and he would be happy to interact with you later as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.